Good afternoon. Saturday afternoon here on a fairly cool and overcast day here in Sydney. I'm going to try and give a commentary on lecture 18 of the Foundations of Esotericism. It's a bit of a difficult one as it returns, obviously with other aspects, to the ideas of evolution and to the dual nature of the human being. And I've called it Evolution and the Twofold Nature, this particular lecture. So Steiner in this lecture is trying to give us some indications that evolution is not just a movement from primitive forms to higher forms. We do not leap merely from primitive human beings to animals similar to the human being, he says. But we can also say that in earlier phases of evolution, there were some aspects of us human beings that were more perfect than they are now. And as we've evolved, so to say, through the evolution of consciousness and moved into this more physical body, our consciousness and our bodies have moved into a duality. He gives pictures, which I think are worth exploring to some extent, of how mythologies and earlier states of consciousness could perceive some of the evolutionary forms in earlier times. One of the interesting ones that comes up is to perceive the astral body of a being trying to incarnate in a bell shape. And he says that we can perceive beings who are trying to incarnate flying around as a bell shape. And this brings my first sort of level of commentary in people, or I suppose a current area of exploration when people are trying to explore perceptions of alien or UFO phenomenon. I suppose the first area of exploration that I'd like to comment on is that if we are seeing UFOs or bell-shaped objects flying around, are we seeing a spacecraft, or are we actually starting to perceive an astral world where we're starting to perceive the flying around of entities trying to incarnate? The same as with alien figures. Are we actually seeing aliens, or are we perceiving elemental beings or angelic beings, but our mind is giving it the form that we are being told by a physical world and calling them aliens? It's a whole realm of exploration there that we need to pause and wonder at when we are seeing, or when we see reports of otherworldly creatures. Are we really seeing an alien from another planet, or are we perceiving a supernatural aspect of our world, either into the more elemental kingdoms, or into those of the people who are trying to incarnate? And it gives a very specific form here, of a bell-shaped form of astral bodies. In fact, it says when we perceive it, we can see bell-shaped astral bodies flying around the world seeking to incarnate. That might be a window into UFO sightings as a point of consideration before we head off and say it's definitely from some other planet or galaxy. Not precluding that, but they are phenomenon in our own solar system and our own world that have these shapes. And when people start to have inexplicable experiences of phenomenon, we immediately reach to alien theory. I would plead that we take a little bit of look at the astral world. It's the same as I read an article just this week that scientists are trying to, or think that they found a solar system or a galaxy or a plane where time is moving backwards. This is exactly how Rudolf Steiner describes the astral world. When we move into perceiving the astral world, we start to perceive things in reverse. So yes, of course, at some point science, when it starts to have instruments of measure, Steiner predicted this, that we will develop instruments by which we can measure some of these astral phenomenon, that we will also discover that there's a world that runs counter to what we think is time and a forward progression, but runs backwards or in an opposite way to the physical world around us. So that's one level of observation. Of course, he then moves into the evolution of as we move through evolution, there is this duality that appears within us. So the first one is that as the human being evolved, we had a snake like body that was raised up, that was male and female alike, like an intertwining of the masculine and the feminine, that even today in our current form and in our current time in evolution, we have a balance in every human being of what we consider the masculine and the feminine forces. These are forces that move not just in the physical, on the physical, they are polarized into externalized bodies, but within the human being, the physical and the etheric are intertwined in that the physical and the life body have a masculine and feminine component within each individual human being. If it's a biologically feminine body, it obviously has a masculine etheric body, and if it's a biologically male body, it has a feminine etheric body. But these also go up through the higher members. A great esotericist, Dion Fortune, she wrote a book on relationship and marriage, and it's really well worth reading that book to discover how these polarities and similarities across genders fructify each other, or at least encourage each other to find another aspect of themselves all the way through the higher members. In this particular lecture, Rudolf Steiner also talks about the dual nature of the etheric body, the dual nature of the astral body, and the dual nature of the ego, and how that, for example, in the astral body, we have a dual nature, a nature that is more oriented towards the desires, and then a part of our astral body that is more oriented towards the noble, giving, reverent side of our nature, and that this higher self, or this higher part of the astral body, is always trying to work into the lower part. And he begins to evolve, or begins to unfold his teaching that evolves over his lifetime, of how in the course of the evolution of consciousness in a human destiny or biography, or over millennia, that the physical body, the etheric body, and the astral body and the ego will transform into higher members. At this point in his life, he's still working with the Theosophical and the Eastern Oriental occultism, where he's calling these three higher members as Buddhi, Manas, or Manas, Buddhi, and Atman. So the transformed astral body becomes the Manas, the transformed life body becomes the Buddhi, and the transformed physical body becomes the Atman. Later on, he gives these particular words some Western occult names, which he then calls the spirit self, as in the Manas, and then the life spirit, so that the life sheath of the etheric body transformed into a higher part of the duality as the life spirit of or Buddhi in the old, or in the Eastern occultism, not in the old occultism, and then Atman as in the spirit human being. In his time it was still called spirit man, but the spiritual essence of the human being as in the transformed physical body. And so he is trying to build here the beginning of his own Western esoteric language of the dual nature, where that we are actually in a world of duality, and this in evolution is a less perfect form than earlier. So evolution isn't a leap from a more imperfect form to a perfect form, but sometimes in evolution the perfect has to go into a less perfect form that has a dual nature within it. But this dual nature is an alchemical process, because it's almost chemistry, which we also use sometimes in our gendered relationships, that the chemistry between two people allows a higher consciousness to emerge, and therefore a transformation or transubstantiation of our nature starts to take place. But through the individual working into their physical and their life bodies, or the etheric body and the soul bodies, we can start to transform by bringing these higher aspects, or the higher half of our dual nature, into work in the more physicalized part of our nature. So the evolution of consciousness into a less perfect form right now, where the dual nature, which at some levels is also known as the masculine feminine nature, but ultimately the intertwining of the two snakes in the caduceus or the Mercury stave is the process by which we can come to a higher wholeness or healing. The healing mysteries is to make whole the dual nature. It's not to eradicate the lower, more physical nature, but to actually take it up and substantiate it into the other half and bring about a higher mystical union. So all very alchemical processes here that then later in Steiner's work receive some further consideration. And part of this consideration is the very fact that the higher natures in us, or the higher half of our duality, is still God-given, as in the angelic forces and the devas of the spiritual world have infused, so to say, the higher nature of our etheric body and the higher nature of our astral body, so that we can help our higher self work into that which has become far too materialized to cause our individuation. So we still have a certain gift, a certain grace working with us out of the good spiritual forces. But he then also in this lecture brings about an area of knowledge that I find interesting. He starts talking about the eighth sphere. So that requires a rather large comment, but he's talking about, I'll just read the part. He says, the greater part of the astral body as it then was fell away. One portion formed the lower parts of the human astral body, and the other newly acquired astral body contained with the head united with the upper parts of the human being. What was then peeled off abandoned this astral body. What was bound up with the form of the winged serpent that could no longer have any development on the earth. It formed as a conglomerate substance the astral sphere of the moon, the so-called eighth sphere. The moon actually houses astral beings which have come into existence through the fact that the human being has thrown something off. So the whole understanding of the eighth sphere is something that we need to grapple with in our times. We can just sort of debunk it, saying, oh, well, that's too complicated. It's the place where all the bad things are. Everything that doesn't work and everything that's become evil is collecting in the eighth sphere and eventually will disappear. However, it is also has come into the existence, in other words, through the evolution of the emergence of the human being through evolution, that what has been sloughed off from us, as we've heard in early lectures, has become the animals, has become the plants, has become the minerals. We also have some of the elemental kingdoms, but we also now realize that as part of the removal of the moon, so if you remember, we go back when the earth, the sun and the moon were one being, and at first the sun left this with beings that had gone ahead very quickly, and then it was left with the earth-moon union, and that the moon forces were making the human being too hardened, and so the moon had to be pushed out. And this picture of pushing things out of the human being, or pushing things out and externalizing things so that the human form could come about, is a really important aspect of evolution, of understanding evolution. And now we see, as part of the removal of the moon, there were aspects of us that we had to push out so that we could remain open to being a human being on a journey of evolution. But it's also created a place where the detrimental forces have become what's known as the eighth sphere. This means, I think, that we are indebted to the eighth sphere as well. And so the whole conversation about what do we do with evil, how do we deal with evil, is a very important paradigm shift for our age. Traditionally, we've had the sort of Star Wars, kind of picture is that the evil is to be overcome. You can go through the paradigms of the poets of Christianity, where good will beat the evil. But is that really how this works? Of course, you could see Star Wars or some of that where the evil is then engaged with in a way where it's attempted to come back into union with the so-called good. That doesn't always work. But yes, ultimately, I think that we have to learn to take a stance or a relationship with the evil where a redemptive process comes about. This will become a theme through some of the later lectures in this particular course. For example, he gives an example later on for healing, where he brings an example of some healers who allow snakes to bite them so that they can process the poison in themselves, so that they have the antibodies in their spittle. And then as healers, when a person gets bitten by a snake, they can use their spit as the medicine. So we need to reabsorb things into ourselves, and then through the work of the duality of the higher nature of our etheric, astral and ego bodies, bring a pendulum swing, so to say. We have to go to a particular level of engagement with something, and then through working upon it, we bring it back to a center with the pendulum swinging and reincorporate it at a higher level. These are all the images that he brings in this lecture, where we see images of the Sphinx, where we see images of the serpent, we see images of the dragon, not necessarily negative forms, but as a process of transformation of this process of being at a higher level, going into a duality, and then through the duality engaging with the various dynamics, including those of the so-called negative forces that have been sloughed off and are held for us in custodianship, so to say, in some places, that then later on need to be reincorporated. I'm not talking about, this decade or whatever. This is obviously long periods of evolution as well, but already in our lives, and especially in our times, that is one of the leading questions. How do we deal with evil? And there are no simple answers. There are at least 7 major categories of how we can perceive evil, and as many, if not more, on how one can engage with it, including, just not paying attention to it. So there's some thoughts from this particular lecture. Some new vistas as we move into the second half of how do we build the foundations. This wonderful name for this course, the foundations of esoteric work. We can see how this particular group of theosophists that we're working with, Steiner must have really appreciated working with him almost on a daily basis to build the foundations of understanding of the commonality, I suppose, of esoteric work that was Eastern occultism, theosophical occultism, and then the building of new language for Western occultism that he then later, already now was calling spiritual science. Okay, well, have a good weekend. I probably won't be able to make another commentary tomorrow, but soon we'll move on to the next lectures and into the deeper, or the latter part of this lecture cycle. Been an interesting journey. Okay, cheers.